near the beginning of August of 1999, and the next thing that happened from September 4th to September the 16th were 4 apartment bombings in which 293 people were killed, and when the 5th bombing was foiled in Ryazan, I think it was September 22nd, it became clear that the people behind that bombing was the FSB. And then, of course, they tried to cover it up. And we all know the story. And the second war in Chechnya started the day after, on September 23rd, after they had built up this panic about Chechen terrorism. It's a horrible story. And then, of course, the devastation of the war and the people who tried to counter the devastation, speak about truth, defend human rights. People like Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Estimirova, and Boris Nemtsov were all killed, murdered, among many others. And this is a very special time because tomorrow, I think as everyone knows, is the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Anna Politkovskaya. It's also, by the way, Putin's 64th birthday. And Sunday is the birthday of Boris Nemtsov. So it's a very special time to remember and to think about this terrible, terrible problem that we're going to be discussing today. I want to just begin. Is Sarah here, Sarah Lillibridge? She shared with me, I don't know if Sarah's here, but she shared with me yesterday an article, and I just want to read from it because I found it to be one of the most moving things I've read. It was written, it was in The Guardian yesterday by Lana Estimirova, the daughter of Natasha. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs because I think it conveys the spirit of the people we're talking about who have been murdered. Just an absolutely extraordinary spirit. And this young woman, I think she might only be 22 years old now, has just written a very beautiful piece. And she writes about when Anna got the interview with Kadyrov in 2004. She writes, she and her mother had to take off very quickly to go to the interview, and then she read the interview in Novaya Gazeta, and she said, by the end of it, I was shaking. Anna masterfully described Kadyrov's nature, his aggression, his bratty, domineering tendencies. This is written by a 22-year-old, by the way. His bratty, domineering tendencies, and most importantly, the underlying insecurity that manifested itself in his ugly mannerisms. Now this dangerous man was entangled with Anna and my mom. I was terrified, but also proud. I wanted to be as brave as them. When I was about 12, I won an essay competition entitled My Future Profession. I wrote that Anna's death, so this essay contest was probably 10 years ago, 2006. I wrote that Anna's death had had an impact on me, and I wanted to become a journalist like her. I wrote that it made me realize the importance of telling the truth, even when others were doing everything to cover it up. I wrote, quote, a journalist must be, and she wrote this when she was 12 years old. I wrote, a journalist must be clever, educated, brave, rebellious. He or she should have a wide imagination and a good sense of humor, be a bit cynical, and sometimes a little bit cunning. Anybody who knew Anna would agree she possessed these qualities. 10 years later, I would add that what really makes a great journalist is compassion. It was Anna's driving force, her superpower. Compassion that made her spend hours in the freezing cold delivering water for hostages in Dubrovka. Compassion was the reason Anna jumped on the first plane to Beslan to report on the deadly school siege, only to be poisoned on the flight. She banged on doors, she wrote or argued with corrupt politicians, shouted at heartless army men. She was fierce, stubborn, and strong. She was unstoppable until the end. You know, when you see that, and Anna was murdered in a contract murder, and Natasha Istimrova, her mother, was murdered, Nemtsov, and the fact that this young girl wants to be like the people who were murdered, have the same courage to speak the truth, I just find that to be overwhelming, not to have fear in this context. We're very, very pleased and honored to have with us today the filmmaker who made the film that we're going to see. Leonid Martiniuk. He was a very, very close associate of Boris Nemtsov. He co-authored with Nemtsov the report on corruption, the report on the Sochi Olympics, and he was working with Nemtsov on the Ukraine report. Nemtsov was killed before that report was published. And he also, his film series, The Lies of the Putin Regime, has had a cumulative 36 million views on YouTube. I want to note in the beginning that one of the people who was supposed to be with us, our friend Anna Politkovskaya, is in Israel and couldn't get his visa in time to join us, but it was Andrei's idea that we do this meeting. And he's going to be here soon, and we're going to get together with Andrei. But I really want everyone to know that, and we'll tell Andrei that we send him our best wishes, and maybe we'll do some kind of an event when Andrei gets here. I now want to introduce Leonid, who's going to say a few words about the film. We're going to watch the film, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. I'll introduce the other panelists after the film when we get started. But Leonid, why don't you come up and tell us a little bit about the film?
First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody who helped to organize this event, this presentation. I'm grateful for this opportunity to show you our documentary, which is very important for me. Boris Nemtsov was my colleague and friend. He was a man whom you can rely. I think a matter of honor, do not forget and to seek justice, and I will. I used to work with Boris Nemtsov more than 5 years. During this time, we had written 2 reports about Putin's corruption and have produced more than 40 videos as part of our project, Lies of Putin Regime. All these works and projects were based on open and verifiable sources of information available for the audiences. In Putin's Russia, it doesn't take an expert in some kind of secret knowledge in order to conduct political education of the people. To do this, first of all, you need courage. Courage to compare the available information and make a conclusion, which no one else dares to do. That short documentary that you will see also was created on the same guideline of using only open and verifiable information. Moreover, it's basically the official information. This data is a result of a criminal investigation which was carried out by Putin's investigators from the Federal Security Service, or FSB. Thank you for your attention.
As far as the crime committed against Boris Yefimovich Nemtsov is concerned, I knew him personally, and our relationship was certainly not always sour. It was he who chose the path of political struggle, personal attacks, and so on. I was used to it, and besides, he was not the only one. However, that doesn't mean you have to kill him.
On February 27, 2015, the leader of the democratic opposition in Russia was killed with 5 shots to his back in the center of Moscow, on the Bolshoi Moskvoretsky Bridge. Who could be behind this crime? The murder happened only several hundred yards away from the Kremlin. The entire territory adjacent to President Putin's main residence is controlled by the Federal Protective Service, monitored around the clock by surveillance cameras, and is patrolled by officers of the Ministry of Interior Affairs.
They committed murder practically on the Red Square, which is impossible to do without cooperating with Russian special services. They did not only commit the crime, but also managed to escape from the crime scene. Just try raising a Ukrainian flag in the middle of Moskvaretsky Bridge. My cameraman was arrested there. I have been detained there as well. The Federal Protective Service is in charge of this area.
The Kremlin is the most protected facility in Russia. However, the criminal case opened on Nemtsov's murder doesn't include video footage, recorded by the multiple Federal Protective Service surveillance cameras. The most likely reason for the FPS to refuse to cooperate is that the cameras show Putin's special service officers being involved in the crime.
A murder in the area under FPS control could never happen without the involvement of FPS. To claim otherwise would be sheer nonsense.
According to the investigation, preparations for Boris Nemtsov's assassination, including physical surveillance, began in October of 2014. Since Nemtsov would frequently move around on foot, the killers had plenty of time to set up an attack in a quiet, empty back alley.
Last time I saw Boris was 9 days before his death. He used to come to the Solidarity office late at night when it was dark outside, walking through obscure back alleys nearby Tretyakovskaya metro station. Boris was never afraid of Moscow and loved to travel by foot. Last time he arrived around 8 p.m., spent about an hour with us and left. He walked home alone. If they simply wanted to kill him, this would have been the perfect opportunity.
The assassins chose to commit their crime on the territory protected by the FPS, instead of a quiet back alley.
I believe it was a completely practical decision. Moscow is packed with policemen and surveillance cameras. Any activity in downtown Moscow is likely to be recorded on camera or noticed by a police officer. The center of the bridge is the only spot where there is no police presence whatsoever. If we agree that the FPS was involved, this would be an ideal place. You can see everything that's going on at the center of the bridge. At 11:30 p.m., the FPS should have had everything under control. They control all the cameras.
For 4 months, the assassins were tracking Nemtsov's movements around Moscow. The Federal Security Service was watching him 24/7 and wouldn't have missed a group of unknown men following him.
Nemtsov kept complaining that he was under surveillance, that the Federal Security Service agents were following him all the time. Their guidelines clearly state that in case they come across a parallel surveillance team, they should report it to their superiors. Such people are to be identified and background checked. At the very least, these individuals should have been detained and interrogated in order to find out why they were following Nemtsov. However, there was no reaction from the Federal Security Service agents. That means they were perfectly aware of who these people were and what their intent was.
The men charged with the murder were arrested 6 days after the assassination, the shortest investigation of a political contract killing in Russia's modern history. This is further proof that the leadership of the FSB knew about the hitmen ahead of time. 4 of the assassins were officers of the Sever Regiment of the Ministry of Interior Affairs. The perpetrators had no personal reasons to commit this crime, and they couldn't take 6 months' leave to travel to Moscow without the express permission of their commanders.
These men are very disciplined, and Kadyrov highly commended them. He called them patriots and seasoned war veterans. Such people could only have been acting under Kadyrov's orders, and Kadyrov certainly coordinated with special service agencies.
At the moment of the crime, 2 assassins, Dadaev and Geremeyev, were away on assignment and carrying their government-issued firearms. The commander of the Sever Regiment reports to General Viktor Zolotov and to the president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov.
These are Putin's troopers.
Это выходцы из батальона «Север».
These men are from the Sever battalion. They're fiercely loyal to Mr. Kadyrov and essentially are the backbone of his power. More generally, they're a part of the Ministry of Interior Affairs forces, headed by General Viktor Zolotov, who, by the way, is close friends with Ramzan Kadyrov and used to be one of Putin's chief bodyguards.
Владимира Путина.
Viktor Zolotov is Ramzan Kadyrov's patron, and it is thanks to him that Kadyrov has direct access to Putin. General Viktor Zolotov and Putin have been close friends ever since their time working together in St. Petersburg. Zolotov was chief of Putin's protective detail and the deputy director of the Federal Protective Service until the fall of 2013. Once he became the commander of the Ministry of Interior Affairs, he retained a great deal of influence in the FPS, which provides security for the Kremlin and controls all access to the facility. At the time of the assassination, the chief of the FPS was Yevgeny Murov, also one of Putin's henchmen. Pete Early, an expert in special services, quotes the story told by Alexander Lunkin, deputy director of the FPS, in his book Comrade J. Lunkin said that he had been with both men in Moscow when Alexander Voloshin's name had been mentioned. Murov and Zolotov had talked openly about Putin's feelings of jealousy towards Voloshin and the political power he wielded. Putin wanted to fire the Grey Cardinal, but for political reasons couldn't. Murov and Zolotov had suddenly begun discussing ways to murder Voloshin. One idea was to kill him and blame Chechen terrorists. Another was to make his execution appear to be a hit by the Russian mafia, the result of some sordid business deal gone bad. Murov and Zolotov decided to make a list of politicians and other influential Muscovites whom they would need to assassinate to give Putin unchecked power. After the two men finished their list, Zolotov announced, "There are too many. It's too many to kill, even for us." Zolotov, Murov, and Kadyrov are Putin's men who would not be able to decide independently to kill a Russian opposition leader in downtown Moscow.
Рамзан Кадыров – это не самостоятельная фигура.
Ramzan Kadyrov is not an independent figure. He's completely controlled by the Kremlin.
100% контролируется Кремлем.
Кадыров, даже если он что-то не знает...
Though Kadyrov might not know some things and didn't attend universities, he's perfectly aware that the decision regarding the life and death of Boris Nemtsov lies in Daddy's domain. By doing anything to Nemtsov, Kadyrov would be crossing the red line and entering the territory under Daddy's jurisdiction. Putin wouldn't tolerate people like Kadyrov calling shots in this area.
Kadyrov strictly followed the rules of the game established by Putin. And 10 days after Nemtsov's murder, Putin awarded Kadyrov a Medal of Honor.
Putin is my idol. My idol is Putin. I love him. I am very, very, very devoted to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. We say to the whole world that we are Vladimir Putin's combat troops. And if we get an order, we'll prove with our actions that this is the case.
A year after the assassination, Putin extended Kadyrov's term as the president of Chechnya.
5 числа истекает срок полномочий.
Your term is going to expire on April 5th. Given your achievements over the last several years, today I will sign a decree appointing you as the acting president of Chechnya. I hope you will be able to stand for re-election this September.
Последующим, надеюсь, в сентябре этого года выходом на выборы.
Thank you for having faith in me. We'll do our best to prove you right, and we will serve you hand and foot, Vladimir Vladimirovich. If you have some critical comments or guidelines, please let us know, and we will try our best to fulfill them 100%.
Viktor Zolotov was also rewarded. Putin promoted Zolotov to 4-star general, appointed him as commander of the Russian National Guard, and made him a member of the Russian National Security Council.
Putin переформировал все силовые структуры страны.
Putin has restructured all of Russia's securities agencies by selecting 400,000 most efficient fighters and transferring them over to a new entity, the National Guard, which is personally managed by General Zolotov.
Подчиненную уже ему лично. Более того,
Moreover, Putin made Zolotov a permanent member of the Security Council, a modern analog of the Soviet Politburo.
по аналогии ввел его в состав Политбюро.
In the year following Nemtsov's assassination, not one of the alleged conspirators was ever interrogated. Nemtsov's family requested that Kadyrov and Zolotov be interrogated, but the investigators refused.
We were hoping that by the end of the summer, the investigators would manage to find Geremeyev, interrogate Kadyrov, etc., but that didn't happen.
Следствие настолько активно.
Initially, the investigation was so active that it even requested to interrogate Kadyrov's close aides Geremeyev and Delimkhanov.
Еремеева и
There were rumors about interrogating Kadyrov himself. This was such a shock to Putin, such a dramatic development, such enthusiasm on behalf of the Federal Security Service and the Investigative Committee that, as we remember, Putin even disappeared from public for a couple of weeks.
недели на две из политического поля.
The investigators had tried twice to press charges in absentia against Ruslan Geremeyev, an officer in the Ministry of Interior Affairs who was allegedly in charge of the assassins. Both times, Alexander Bastrykin, the head of the investigative committee, refused to sign an indictment. There's only one man in Russia who can direct the court and the investigative committee not to interrogate obvious suspects.
Сегодня уже ясно, что с Немцовым расправилась власть действующая.
Today it is clear that the current government murdered Nemtsov. What we see today in terms of what is going on with the investigation, which failed to interrogate the key eyewitnesses and has no desire to do so, what we hear in their clumsy explanations and clarifications clearly indicates that the government made a political decision to let it slide.
The most likely sequence of events was the following. In the summer of 2014, Putin instructed Viktor Zolotov and Yevgeny Murov to organize Nemtsov's assassination. Zolotov conveyed Putin's orders down to Kadyrov. Kadyrov assembled a team of assassins out of Chechen officers of the Ministry of Interior Affairs. Zolotov secured the cooperation of the troops, while Murov involved the Federal Protective Service. In October, the officers began to track Nemtsov's movements around Moscow. The FSB, which was following Nemtsov, discovered the parallel surveillance by Kadyrov's men, realized their purpose, but didn't intervene. The goal of the FSB was to quickly detain the assassins after the crime was committed, in order to weaken Kadyrov's position in Putin's inner circle. Once Putin realized that the rivalry between Kadyrov and the FSB was a threat to the stability of the regime, he instructed the investigative committee to freeze the investigation of Nemtsov's murder at the level of the assassins.
Путин говорил о сакральной жертве, а я к этому отношусь очень серьезно.
Putin was talking about a sacrificial victim, and I take this very seriously. If a high-ranking KGB man, and there is no such thing as a former KGB man, who has all special service agencies under his command, mentions that there is a plot to assassinate an opposition leader, it means that A, he has such information, and B, if he does not prevent such an assassination, even though he has every capability to stop it, it means that he is the organizer. Therefore, if anything happens to any member of the Opposition Coordination Council, you should know who is behind it.
Here will be my translator during discussing. Alexei Sobchenko.
Okay, a lot to talk about. And thank you for that, Leonid. you all saw that Andre was in the film, and that even the film was suggested by Andre, and we look forward to his coming here. And there are a lot of questions raised by the film, especially sort of toward the end, which I don't fully understand, but maybe we can get into it, as to what extent was there a real conflict between the FSB and Kadyrov? Because, you know, I think a lot of you have seen this report by Ilya Yashin, who was also a very close associate of Nemtsov, a threat to national security. And the whole point of this report is that, you know, Putin has created this monster, this Frankenstein, which is not controlled by the FSB. And that, you know, maybe there's a conflict there. We don't know, but this is something we'll want to talk about today as we try to understand what's going on in Russia today, which, you know, I think Americans are ready to listen. More Americans than just us and people like us are ready to listen to these, you know, what we know about these issues, because Russia has managed to involve itself in our presidential election in a lot of ways. And so there's attention, and you have people's attention right now. We need to think about that. People are trying to understand this country and how it is acting in the world, obviously in Aleppo today, but also in hacking, you know, the DNC, and one of the candidates having, you know, seeming to admire Putin. So in any event, we're going to be talking about that, and we have quite a terrific panel. In addition to Leonid, who I've already introduced, we have Maria Stankovaya, who is at Columbia University. She is looking at, you know, the politics of inside the Kremlin, and maybe she'll be able to talk to us a little bit about that. We have Kyle Parker, who is with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I think a lot of people know that Kyle was one of the key, certainly one of the key staffers behind the passage of the Magnitsky bill, which I consider the most important piece of human rights legislation adopted by this country in the last generation or two, really a fundamental law. And of course, they're now trying to make it a global, to apply globally, because it's such an effective way to get at people who are real criminals and for whom there is impunity within their own countries. And then Maria Lanskoy, who oversees the Eurasia program, and not just the Russia program, but the Eurasia program at NED, and also co-authored a book on Chechnya with Ilya Sakhmatov, the former foreign minister of Chechnya. So we have a lot to talk about, and maybe we'll start with Leonid to talk to us a little bit about the case. I should note, maybe before he starts, to just note that earlier this week, the trial of the 5 accused of carrying out the killing of Nemtsov began. But of course, you know, we're dealing here with contract killers. We're not dealing with the people up above who gave the orders. And that's what really has to be investigated. And I think we should also note, you saw in the film, Putin at the end of March telling Kadyrov, and there was a lot of speculation, Kadyrov said he may step down, lots of luck, that he wanted him to serve a 3rd term as president of Chechnya. And just this week, I think on Tuesday, he was sworn in for his 3rd term as president. So things are happening right now. So we a lot of current developments. So let me turn it over to Leonid, and then we'll sort of have a round of discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Leonid.
Specific goals. It should help Russian audience to realize the true nature of the current ruling group in Russia. They're not just thieves. This is widely known among Russians. Russian ruling class are murderers. As for the Western audience, we would like to convey one simple idea. Every politician from a democratic country, from the USA, the UK, France, Italy, etc., who keeps in touch with Putin, becomes his ally with whom Putin might create a coalition. Every such politician is personally responsible for legitimization of a murderer who is in the presidential chair. Putin is a serial killer. The assassinations of journalist Anna Politkovskaya and former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko were also linked to Putin, but no other crime provides such a graphic chain of evidence leading to Putin. All what Putin was doing after the murder of Boris Nemtsov was another proof that it was Putin who ordered the murder. Only Putin could destroy a formal investigation and instruct the FSB and investigative committee to stop the investigation on the executive level. And only Putin could extend Kadyrov's presidential term and raise the political status of Zolotov. Western leaders should be aware that when they shake hands with Putin, they shake hands with the murderer. Thank you.
Okay. I want to turn to Maria to maybe talk to us a little bit about what you think is going on in the Kremlin, in Putin's mind even. I remember some months ago, I went to an event in this town where the U.S. ambassador was speaking, and he said that Putin is a very nervous man. He's not a secure man. He watches repeatedly the films about the death of the Libyan dictator, Gaddafi. And he created this National Guard that you saw in the film of 400,000 people. These are not actions done by somebody who feels secure. And maybe you could talk to us about what you think is going on and how secure he really is.
Invitation. It's a great opportunity to remember the really heroic and courageous activists in Russia who died, to a large extent for us, trying to basically push forward some changes. And before we proceed to investigation of the causes in the Putin mind, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the general situation in Russia. Nemtsov is an unfortunate and one of the most outrageous crimes that happened in Russia recently. But in general, it's important to remember that the position in Russia, and by position I mean not necessarily only people who are known political activists, anybody who disagrees with the main direct line, be it environmentalists, people of different ideologies, LGBT people, people of different sexual affiliations, anything, anybody can be under attack. So I wanted to quote the report recently published by the Center of Economic and Political Reform that specifically focused on attacks against the so-called broadly defined opposition. Once again, it's not necessarily political activists, so people who have anything to do with politics. People who fight for cleaner air in Russia are similarly under threat. So according to the report that traced the dynamics of the repressions and the attacks on the opposition activists in Russia over the last 4 years, there have been a total of 238 cases of aggression against the Russian opposition activists. And the interesting thing that they do not come in a strict linear pattern. This number of the attacks tend to fluctuate in certain type of ways. They tend, the overall number of the attacks against the Russian activists tend to increase, but on some occasions more than on others. So in 2012, you have 35 cases of attack against these people. In 2013, 38. In 2014, 60 suddenly. 2015, 50. And this year, 2016, was the largest on the number of the attacks. 55 cases just the first half of the year. Now, you'd think that most of these occasions have to do with elections or politics related events. Not necessarily. In fact, they tend to come in themes, and the themes are related to whatever it is that on the Kremlin agenda right now. So if we talk about 2012, the Pussy Riot was a big deal. This is the punk group that created this performance in the Christ Cathedral in Moscow. And most of the attacks had to do with this Orthodox-related themes. In 2013, everything that had to do with non-traditional sexual orientations and LGBT was a big deal. 2014, people who were attacked had to do with Ukraine, obviously, and the opposition protests in Russia that were against the war in Ukraine. In general, throughout all of this period, we observe the increase of the attacks against the political activists that are related to the elections. But what I'm trying to convey here, it's not elections alone that create this kind of situation that the political activists and political figures are under attack. And the attacks are pretty brutal. Over 50% of cases, this is a direct physical violence, including brass knuckles, beats, iron bars, and pipes, and very often firearms as well. Nemtsov murder is the most tragic event in this line, but we have at least 3 other people opposition-related figures who were murdered. And very often people not murdered, but they're so physically, so severely attacked that it takes them forever to recover. For example, one of Navalny activists had all of his teeth pretty much destroyed in one of those attacks. So who are those people who attack? That's a regular question, right? In this movie, we talk a lot about how all the side indicators point towards certain kind of connection to the Kremlin, right? But we don't know, there's no direct evidence, right? We don't have a law or anything, the paper document signed by Putin ordering this. So how do we know that these increasing attacks against the Russian activists are related to the Kremlin and not by just, I don't know, the overall public swings in the public opinion in Russia, and people are doing that on the grassroots level. The reason is the activists who do that in Russia. So the activists who implement this violence. Most often, in over 22% of cases, and this number keeps increasing, the people who actually implement these violent attacks belong to some kind of organizations, little militias, little groups. These groups do not remain stable. They change over time. So you have anti-Maidan protests back in 2014. You had Nashi, the youth organizations, even earlier. Right now, the new trend includes different kind of ultra-Orthodox movements, such as the National Liberation Movement or something called Serb movement, that are all related to this great idea of the Orthodox or Slavic unity or something like that. Or sometimes it would be the structures related to the police or more certain kind of military structures within Russia. It used to be fashionable to be an Orthodox activist, but it's no longer so, according to the recent trend. So we know that these groups, so the question once again, how do we know these groups are not just grassroots mobilization? Maybe people in Russia are naturally, outraged by these traitors, the so-called fifth column, and they just want to prosecute them, right? After all, 41% of the Russians, according to the 2015 survey, support the political action, the state action against the so-called fifth column, the opposition, the traitors of the motherland and whatnot. So the reason that how we know that is that most of these local small level militia groups end up to be in one way or another ultimately linked to one or another state structure. So for example, if we talk about the Entel, there was Dmitry Entel was one of the notorious Orthodox activists who would very often attack certain kind of exhibits on these Orthodox religious grounds. Now it was known very clearly related to one of the Orthodox officials, chaplain, and the activism of this person was only on the rise when Chaplin was in power. The moment Chaplin was fired from the structure, the Orthodox church structure where he was working, the Intel disappeared as well. He was recently interviewed, and he said pretty much he has now different interests. He's no longer interested in prosecuting the opposition. The same links were recently established between the police, the Russian police, and the Moscow mayor office, and the so-called officers of Russia, another militia group that implemented severe attacks against the exhibits in Russia recently. And more or less every single organization, this local grassroots group, will end up to be in one way or another related to the Kremlin ultimately, or some kind of the state structure. It's not necessarily the Kremlin, but most likely one of the officials. The same goes for Fedorov, another politician, parliamentary in Russia, who has his own militia group, etc., etc., etc. The dangerous dynamics in this is that definitely these groups are on the rise, and there is more and more of them. The attacks against the opposition and the different kind of liberal activists in Russia are increasing right now. So the first indicator is just clear direct links to the state structure. The other indicator is that in most cases, if this militia group attacks an opposition activist, it either ends up not being prosecuted at all or prosecuted very mildly, unlike what happened to the opposition guys who are really prosecuted very severely and often put into jails and assigned real prison terms. So the question is, why is this state in Russia doing this? So what the interest? If anything, it's creating more potential uncontrollable violent structures and potentially losing its monopoly on violence. So what's the Kremlin interest? So there are different approaches to this. Some people say that the Kremlin tries to hide behind these local grassroots groups. So in this way, the repressions against the opposition are on the rise. But technically, it's not the Kremlin itself who's doing that. It's just people, People are really unhappy about the opposition in Russia, and that's what they do. Another theory has to do with the fact that this patriotic sentiment in Russia that has been mobilized by the Ukrainian war and all this mobilization by the state has to be channeled somehow. And these militia structures provide a very useful, convenient vehicle for that channel. But in my opinion, it's this cool rise of these militia terrorist paramilitary structures also has to do with a new way of legitimacy that the Kremlin is trying to create. You know that the stability of the Kremlin in the 2000s was largely based on the economic growth. Unfortunately, it's no longer the case. Russia's economic situation is really very bad, and it's unlikely it's going to change anytime soon. So the Kremlin implemented a different type of mobilization in 2014, the whole war, little victorious war, that's always helpful for the ratings. Did work for quite some time, but it's also true that the impact by now has probably evaporated if you look at the sociology. Now, in my opinion, what has been done right now against the Russian opposition is a new way of legitimacy, is a new way for the Kremlin to legitimize itself, to defend its existence. So you basically create the enemy inside of the state. That's nothing new. It's a very old strategy. Usually it works. And you pretend that people are, in fact, mobilized inside of the country, are mobilized against these traitors, the enemies. And they're also very convenient very convenient tool to scapegoat everything that's not going right in the country and outside of the country. It's important to point out that Zbigniew Bzezhinsky pointed out way before that Putin's regime is remarkably similar to the fascist regime in Italy. Because in a similar way, the regime speculates on the ideas of the great national past and this mobilization of this glorious past and trying to basically create the future. In a very similar way, Kremlin economy and this big corporate organizations control most of the economy in Russia so that the individual is completely subordinated to the state. And in a very similar way, Kremlin right now creates these paramilitary forces based on the security forces. And as we know, as I mentioned, a lot of these little structures are ultimately related to the Russian security forces. So this is a very efficient way to both control the dissent and provide the legitimacy to the regime. And unfortunately, what we might be observing right now is exactly this Putin system transitioning into this kind of the fascist structure. That's definitely a very scary outcome for us to see. And nonetheless, it's still, I just wanted to point out at the very end of my talk, it's still encouraging to see so many, brave young Russians, despite all these threats, despite all these murders and attacks, still fighting for the freedom of the country, and hopefully they'll end up succeeding in some, long term.
In the report in The Economist 10 years ago on the murder of Anna Politkovskaya, they used the word fascist. So I don't know that they're transitioning now. It's a question. And you also didn't let me know how nervous you think Putin is, and also the issue of FSB and Kadyrov.
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question. I just wanted to emphasize the situation with the opposition first. Yeah, we know for sure that there's a lot of restructuring within the system in the Kremlin going on right now. Ilya Yashin, as was pointed out, has a great report that investigates deeper into the specific relationship between FSB and Ramzan Kadyrov. It is clear that FSB, the Russian security forces, hated Kadyrov for quite a while. Kadyrov has this kind of invincibility within the Russian power structures, where he has pretty much what is his own army and his own security forces, and he is not. He has this power and authority not to abide to the laws, to the rules that everybody else under the Kremlin cover abides to. And security forces in Russia had the problem with that for quite a while. So it is true that the murder of Nemtsov might have provided to them a really good pretext to attack Kadyrov, which what exactly is what they tried to do, according to the movie that we just saw. But once again, Kadyrov ended up being protected even against the attacks, very strong and severe attacks by the security. I have from different sources heard back in the spring that Kadyrov's position was not as strong at some point. He was attacked from different sides, and different groups within the Kremlin even came up with a potential person to replace him later. The person was even introduced in Putin, and Putin seemed to more or less like that person who was security related, but ended up not replacing Kadyrov, which again was predictable, because Kadyrov is the only, more or less, one and only person who controls the situation in Chechnya. It's very unclear what's going to happen if he's gone. A lot of people hate him within Chechnya and outside of Chechnya. It's quite clear that certain destabilization will begin once Kadyrov is gone. Putin's legitimacy and his coming to power, let me remind you, was initially based on securing certain kind of peace with Chechnya, right? And Kadyrov was one important element in the whole chain. So it's, up until the new re-election, Putin clearly is not going to do anything about that because he doesn't want to destabilize the situation. It's very unclear if he will be able to do anything about that after he's re-elected for precisely the same reasons. It's unclear whether the new person is going to ensure the same order, like at least on the surface, as we observe right now within the Chechnya itself. As to the insecurity of Putin himself, we are kind of right now on the shaky ground of the Kremlinology. We do know that the tensions within the Kremlin elites have been on the rise lately, and they have largely to do with the fact that the economic growth has been, as I mentioned, the economic situation is in decline right now in Russia. The general pie is shrinking. There's different power structures are no longer getting the access to the resources. The fight for those resources increases, Add to this mix the sanctions introduced by the Western countries, and the sanctions have been really painful for the country in general, the population, and the elites, precisely the elites as well. Definitely, there's a lot of lobbying efforts within the power structures of the Kremlin to do something about the sanctions. But you cannot do anything about the sanctions as long as Putin is in power. That's also true. So it doesn't mean that Putin's position is in some is under threat. At least for now, it's not visible. But it's clear that the dissent within the Kremlin structures has been on the rise. And the side indicator of that is the recent increase in the leaks about what's going on within the Kremlin elites that we have observed. For example, there are quite a few successful investigations against the corruption by the Kremlin officials going on right now. And these kind of things rarely evolve on their own. Usually, in order to investigate some kind of corruption case, you need some kind of leak. And those leaks are likely coming from those unhappy, frustrated people within the power structures. Doesn't mean that Putin, once again, that Putin's position is threatened. I think he's still the most powerful person in Russia and more or less has the situation under control, but probably ensures that he's quite anxious. And the recent reshuffling of the elites, there's a lot of changes within the elite structures going on, implemented right now by Putin. They likely have something to do with that. So overall, it's clear that the situation is unstable. It's in dynamics. We see the attacks against the opposition also have to do with the insecurity within the Kremlin. That's for sure. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that any kind of big change is coming anytime soon, but we have to keep monitoring the whole situation, to see what happens next.
Okay, thanks. And talking about changes here, maybe first of all, you could give us your sense of what Maria, your assessment of the situation that Maria has just been talking about, and whether are we on the verge of some greater repression now because of the economic insecurity and the feelings of insecurity within the Kremlin?
Thank you, Phil. Can I start with actually the images at the end of is this okay? Where Nemtsov is sitting with other members of the Opposition Coordination Council, and he's saying, we've heard that the regime needs a sacrificial lamb. And it struck me that of the four sitting there, Udaltsov is in prison, Chirikova is in exile, Kasparov is in exile, and Nemtsov is dead. So the key figures in the protest movement of 2011, 2012 have all been neutralized in one way or another. And it was, to me, a very powerful moment to reflect back on. Let me hit a couple of points. First, this whole question of what the assassination of Nemtsov has unleashed within the Kremlin and among the security services and so forth. It's clear that there are competitions. Unbelievable leaks about the Nemtsov, the investigation into the murder of Nemtsov, where it's clear that FSB is leaking details of the investigation to Novaya Gazeta. So first of all, that's absolutely clear. There are also clear competitions between the FSB and the investigative committee that we saw this summer. So two main security services going after each other pretty aggressively, where Russia's main thief in the law, so the biggest gangster in Russia, is arrested suddenly by the FSB, and people in the investigative committee, which is a competing security service, are then arrested for providing cover and being in cahoots with Russia's biggest criminal. So you have different poles. You have Kadyrov and his forces on one hand. You have already mentioned the National Guard under Zolotov, which is directly under Putin, who needs, for some reason, Putin feels that he needs a 400,000 strong military directly subordinate to him, in addition to all the other militaries out there. So that's kind of the lay of the land of the major security services out there. What to do about Kadyrov is very unclear, because on one hand, he is kind of Putin's closest, they refer to each other as father and son. On the other hand, he has also trespassed in various ways against other security services and also against the military. It hasn't been possible to fully investigate the Nemtsov killing because people in Kadyrov's circle are simply unavailable to the other security services. It's very convenient to have a Kadyrov on whom you can pin responsibility. And it fits a stereotype of unruly, violent Chechens, and it can be written off. But of course, Kadyrovцы are part of the MVD, another security service. He is himself appointed by Putin. He's confirmed through Russian elections. So it's not so easy to just say that, this is not somehow to divorce Kadyrov from his overall political context. And I think the film does that very well, that ultimately the responsibility has to go back politically to Putin himself. Another kind of bigger point, and I agree with Maria that the regime is changing and changing in a negative way, that targeted repression, one has to ask themselves whether targeted assassinations and targeted repressions may become more massive in the future. And there are two recent events that point in that direction are extremely worrying. One are the Yarovaya laws that were passed in July that extend the possibilities of surveillance by far beyond even the levels, extreme levels of existing surveillance. They require internet providers to store, internet service providers, mobile operators to store data, metadata for 3 years, and all content for 6 months. These laws are technically at the moment, and also to break encryption, without any warrants, without, it sort of erases completely any notion of privacy. The way that they're written now is technically not possible because end-to-end encryption cannot be broken. But the intent of the law, which is, and it has other, so I should say Yarovaya laws have other implications. They limit possibility of religious speech. They impose adult criminal sanctions on 14-year-olds. There's a number of sort of terrible aspects to the Yarovaya laws, but the idea that some kind of mass surveillance, mass repression can be put into place is inherent in those amendments. And the other worrying development, and we should say that we just had the Duma elections. On the eve of the Duma elections, there was a leak to Kommersant newspaper that said that there's a plan to unify the KGB on the basis of the FSB. So basically, the only reform that there had been of the KGB was breaking it in 1990, 1991, breaking it into the different services. So different, what had been the portion of the KGB that did internal work became the FSB, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and the rest. It was just there was never really an ability to truly reform the parts of the KGB or to establish like parliamentary oversight or anything like that. But at least what Yeltsin was able to do was to break it into those pieces that are competing. The idea that several of the services could be combined into one and form a kind of larger, more powerful lobby and undo some of that competition. Their current check on the services is the competition among them and the competition that I just described. The idea of reuniting them again into one service is another very worrying sign in terms of how things could unfold.
Very much. And Kyle, Maria said that the sanctions were painful. Do you think they're painful enough? Should they be stronger? And how about the Europeans?
No, I don't think they're painful enough. I'm not encouraged about the Europeans. I think we're in a position where, and in fact, we were speaking just before about, this talk about new sanctions in the wake of what's going on in Syria, and the feeling is not too likely. But what I look at is where Moscow expected us to be at a few key points in sanctions, and at least from what I've heard, that they've been pleasantly surprised, in the sense that they were worried. In going back to when the administration released its first Magnitsky list, and how that really was a great sigh of relief for the Kremlin, that we didn't go nearly as far as that they had expected. How in the wake of the sanctions applied following Russia's forcible and illegal occupation of Crimea, that we hit 3 or 4 Duma deputies, is sort of even hard to understand exactly why we picked the ones we did, and they were prepared for an entire sanction of the parliament. And so I think, we have a ways to go. And that said, what has been done is still important. It's still significant. It still bothers them. We know from their reaction, just this hysterical demands the other day from Russia over the plutonium deal, that they need reparations from the sanctions that don't bother them anyway, but they need to be paid for the damage. They need the Magnitsky Act repealed. They need us to reduce our force posture in Europe. So, they're certainly having an effect. And broadly speaking, the biggest sanction that hurts Russia right now is the one that's always the closest to potentially being repealed, and that's the ban on long-term lending. That is directly connected to what's going on in Donbass, and therefore on the table in an ideal world where you actually were to see Minsk implementation.
In light of everything that's been happening, does anybody take these complaints from Putin's regime seriously?
Oh, these complaints about what's going on?
About what we're doing.
About what we're doing. I don't know that anyone does, but I'm prepared to be surprised. I've been surprised for the past, 8-10 years. It's still, to see the EU's reaction. I think the External Action Service put out a statement after the MH17 findings investigation that didn't even mention Russia. And that to me is rather mind-boggling, particularly when you look. I was thinking, coming here today, it's been a particularly discouraging, demoralizing time to really work this field. How can we, on the one hand, it seems like here we are talking about the deaths of individuals whom of course many of us knew and significant and important, and yet there's an absolute siege going on in Aleppo, where our diplomats are calling it barbaric. A report that again doesn't reveal, but simply reminds us that yes, the Russians did shoot down that plane over eastern Ukraine, and I asked myself, how would it have been different if 100 or so passengers on that plane were American citizens? I don't know the answer, but on one level it shouldn't matter, right? Because it's a mere accident of fate, and a reminder of just how close this comes to affecting everyone. Tens of thousands dead in Ukraine. This is all just looking back to 10 years ago when Politkovskaya was assassinated, and trying to see, could we have imagined, with all the warnings that were happening, what we were about to see in the coming 10 years, and really feeling that either we have forgotten or we never really believed what we heard very eloquently stated by people like Andrei Sakharov, and the link between how a regime treats its own people and how its foreign policy acts. So to me, there is the link there, that we will not be able to understand Aleppo without understanding Politkovskaya and Nemtsov and what's happened in Russia over a decade and a half, and that, again, in the human rights field, we probably all do a better job of really trying to press that point, that these are not simply other issues. They're not reducible to a laundry list that needs to be raised or not raised. They have to be the paper on which the list is written. I mean, there's really nothing more important. And I'm also just struck when looking at the political violence in Russia, how it disproportionately singles out the truth tellers, right? And you see that in Putin, the title of your other film about the lies of the Putin regime, and the importance of truth, and how what we're really seeing here with the Russian propaganda and how much they dedicate it to is a battle for reality itself, right? We talk about being on the right side of history. I think another way of rephrasing that would be being on the right side of reality, right? Because to lie to the people is essentially to attempt to withhold their participation in reality, right? And so that's what people like Politkovskaya and Boris Nemtsov and others have attempted to do, is to open that space. So to me, that's instructive as we look at our own policies. I sort of feel like, free media, free media, free media. That is the most important thing. That if we can't, if these stories can't be told in Russia, let them be told here, right? I think about people like Nemtsov and Politkovskaya and Magnitsky and Shekachikin and others, and think that until there's a monument built to each of them in Russia, let's build those monuments here, right? Let's do that in these types of conversations, in articles and journals, in legislation. I double-checked Nemtsov resolutions. There were 5 separate congressional resolutions on Boris Nemtsov's assassination. Dramatically more than I could find on anyone else. There was one on Litvinenko. I went back to 1977 and found 2 on Steve Biko. Again, a resolution seems somewhat unsatisfying, but I think that this, what you had said, Carl, when you were quoting from Lana Estemirova. Yeah, if I might do the same, I was looking back to her and to others, and I, for some hope, is this is a brief excerpt from Roman Anin, who works for Novaya Gazeta and was recently, a year or so ago, awarded the Knight Prize in journalism, given to him by Wolf Blitzer, prestigious venue. And this is what he said. He said, this award belongs to Sergei. He was speaking of Sergei Magnitsky and the investigation he worked on. The man who refused to betray his conscience, the man who sacrificed his life. He could have saved himself many times just by telling a lie. He never did, and that is why he was killed in prison. In this sense, Magnitsky reminds me of my colleagues at Novaya Gazeta who have been killed during the past 10 years. Anna Politkovskaya, Yuri Shekachikin, Igor Domnikov, Anastasia Baburova. Their profession was not reporting. Their profession was telling the truth. Their example and their fate demonstrate that in Russia, an honest journalist or even a brave person like Sergei Magnitsky can't tell the truth without risking his life. People like Politkovskaya and Magnitsky inspire everyone as journalists in Russia. By sacrificing their lives, they changed millions of lives. They changed my life. I'm not the only one who has been changed by the deaths of Politkovskaya and Magnitsky in Moscow and in the regions. I meet more and more people who want to be like them. And so I think that, just the for me, it's trying to resist the urge to negotiate with oneself and get too concerned about the results and the outcome, and simply allowing the decency to prevail, right? Trying to do the right thing and extend the solidarity and make sure that's not broken, and sort of let the chips fall where they may.
We had an event here yesterday. Yesterday was the 80th anniversary of the 80th birthday of Václav Havel, and that's what he said repeatedly. Let's take a few questions from the audience, 3 or 4, and then we'll let the panelists respond, and then we'll close it off. So I see 2 hands here, and 3 hands. So identify yourselves when you speak, and we'll take the audience participation consecutive.
Thank you for the film and organizing this great event. 2 quick questions. Ilya Zaslavsky, Free Russia Foundation and Legatum Institute. First question to Leonid and Maria. Why do you think, I share your view that Putin is personally responsible for the murder of Nemtsov. Why do you think there are still many people in opposition who think that it's maybe he didn't know, maybe it was Kadyrov who did it just because he understood that Putin might want it? So they still take away the blame away from Putin and FSB, FSO. So that's first question. Second question to other 3 panelists. So there's been, in my view now, overwhelming evidence that in top of Russian elite we have outright criminal figures, mobsters, people connected with murders, money laundering, dating from St. Petersburg days, and it's dozens of people who figure in Spanish prosecution and FBI files, Bastrykin, Reznik, deputy chairman of central bank torsion. The list goes long. Human rights violators, Ramzan Kadyrov. So how, and Leonid just mentioned, Western leaders should know that when they shake hands with murderers. Obviously, you can't stop communicating with Russia as a state, but should they, do you have any policy advice to next administration? How should they treat Russia in the light that it's essentially a legally failed state? How do you translate this fact that there are mobsters now in power to actions of Western leaders?
Okay, thanks. And there was a question over there, another one.
Hello, and thank you so much. My name is Maria, and I'm a private person, and I have a question to Leonid. What is the main idea of your movie? Actually, we see here a very private story about some man who was killed. So why it's so important for people of the United States? Why it's so extremely important, as Piankovsky said, now when we have an election, in a month, what is your message to people of the United States? What is your goal?
Okay, thank you. Is that Andre over there? Yep. The other Andre Illyriano? Okay.
Yes, Carl, if you allow me just 3 comments, not questions.
But be brief, because we're getting to the closing
time. Yes, the first one, since you've kind of alluded to the nature of the regime as fascist, or at least you raised this question, and since a few months ago you had another panel with participation of the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, who insisted that as a hybrid regime, I think you would contribute enormously. I mean, you yourself with your colleagues in the political science, if you set up a session panel or publication in the journal, just that would really analyze the nature of the regime, and this confusion that has been created by statement that it is a hybrid regime would not be repeated anymore, neither in Russian nor in English. The first recommendation. The second one, I would suggest not to exaggerate and not overestimate the some kind of debates or some kind of cracks within the regime, or not cracks, some kind of so-called debates between some Siloviki organizations within the regime. It's certainly interesting for observers how Mr. Himmler was not happy with Mr. Kaltenbrunner, but he did not play any substantial role in the policies within the Germany and outside Germany. And the third, to Kyle's, I think, very important remarks about the connection between what is going within the country and outside the country. I think it's probably indication that the title of the session was not fully correct, because it should be said political violence not in Putin's Russia, but political violence by Putin's Russia or by Putin's Kremlin. And that is why it is very important to see some kind of unbelievable kind of inability of the U.S. administration or U.S. analytical some kind of or political groups to create a coherent policy toward this particular regime. And that just NET is perfectly positioned to actually to lead these efforts in designing and probably even helping to implement the right policy towards such type of regimes.
Good points, Andrei. Maybe one more if there is one, otherwise we're going to go to the panel. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of there not being any hands. We'll go to the panel. And I know, Leonid, there were some questions for you. If you want to go first, the floor is yours.
Окей. Первый вопрос был по поводу того, почему очень многие оппозиционеры в России останавливают свою, так скажем, логическую цепочку виновников, организаторов и исполнителей убийства на Кадырове.
The first question was regarding the many opposition activists in Russia who do not go far enough and stop on Kadyrov without bringing all the way to the charges against Putin.
Первая причина, потому что российское информационное поле, оно на 90% контролируется государственными СМИ. А государственные СМИ сотрудничают с ФСБ. А ФСБ выгодно останавливать так сказать, цепочку именно на Кадырове, потому что их задача снять Кадырова, а Путин, то есть вредить Путину, они не планируют, по крайней мере, я этого не вижу сейчас.
The reason number one is that the Russian media by 90% is controlled by the government, and the media work closely with the FSB. And FSB would be happy to get rid of Kadyrov, but it was never seen its goal as removing Putin, and that's why they influence the media to stop the criticism right there.
Вторая причина, какую я вижу, в том, что, находясь в Вашингтоне, проще в плане безопасности говорить о том, что организатор, несомненно, Путин. Потому что если ты находишься в Москве, это психологически гораздо труднее сделать, тем более заявить это в средствах массовой информации.
And the second reason is that while being in Washington, it's much easier and much more you feel much comfortable by saying that the mastermind of this crime was Putin. In Moscow, you don't feel that comfortable to say that. You feel the physical insecurity.
Ну а третье, нет сомнений, что часть оппозиции инфицирована сотрудниками ФСБ, агентами, поэтому они просто работают так, как их кураторы сказали.
And the third reason is that there is no doubt that part of opposition is infiltrated by the KGB, by the FSB agents, and they strictly follow the instructions of what they were told by their superiors.
Да, но, к счастью, есть, вот, например, мы цитируем Владимира Милова, который сейчас находится в Москве, и он даже как лидер партии отправлял запрос в ФСБ, почему люди, которые, несомненно, следили за Борисом Немцовым, никак не фигурируют в уголовном деле, нет никаких их показаний, объяснений, почему они следили, как это произошло, что они не заметили кадыровцев, почему они не помешали преступлению. Ничего этого нет в уголовном деле.
Fortunately, there are still some brave people in Russia, like Vladimir Milov, who was mentioned in this documentary, who sent personally requests to FSB to report why the people who were observing Nemtsov, who were following him, why they never were detained, why they never were reported, and why there was such a disconnect. In other words, there are still people who ask these questions.
А остальные известные оппозиционеры, которые говорят именно об ответственности Путина непосредственной, это люди, которые уже уехали из России. Это Гарри Каспаров, и Андрей Пянковский, и Андрей Ларионов. Их всех нет в России сейчас.
And all those prominent opposition leaders who still talk about Putin's involvement in this crime, they left Russia. I'm referring specifically to Andrei Pyankovsky, Garry Kasparov, and Andrei Larionov.
Был второй.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else?
Второй вопрос. Основной месседж: с Путиным нельзя сотрудничать, его надо изолировать, его надо останавливать везде, где только можно. Это было понятно после вторжения в Грузию, но, к сожалению, не были предприняты соответствующие меры.
The main message was that one cannot work with Putin. Putin should be checked and stopped wherever you can. And originally he was supposed to be stopped back in 2008 in Georgia, but unfortunately this message was not conveyed properly.
Okay, thanks. Let's maybe get some final comments from our other three panelists. Try to be brief, a minute or two, no more than that if you can. Maria, then Miriam, and finally Kyle.
Follow up on what has been said. By the way, I really concur with the comment by Andrei Larionov about how important it is to realize that Russia's regime is not hybrid. There's no, like hybrid involves there's some kind of democracy in there. There's no democracy in the Russian system. On all the classifications is a typical pure and clear theocracy. So we're debating what kind of theocracy, like what kind of dynamics it has. It's going to be fascist, or like what's the role in the violence implemented by the state. But the very fact that it's a very pure dictatorship, completely unfree system, I think should be out of debate for now. Yeah, and I just once again wanted to say that we all loved Nemtsov. His murder definitely signified a new beginning of certain kind of new era in the development of Russia. I, for example, personally cried all night when I learned that he died. It was really unexpected. And once again, wanted to express my admiration for people who still in Russia and still fighting, sacrificing their lives, we can tell it now, for our future.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the graveyard of Russian activists is vast. There are a lot of people who've died for this work, and there are a lot of people who keep doing it. And one of them is Milashina, who remarkably has picked up for Politkovskaya and for Istumirova, and continues to publish, and did a long piece this week in honor of Politkovskaya, and sort of explaining how Kadyrov has worn out his mandate and is becoming just so much of a liability that, in fact, there had been assassination attempts against him this summer. Milashina was at one point, about a year ago, threatened specifically by Kadyrov very directly, and basically saying, the same thing can happen to you as to Politkovskaya. And she published on her Facebook, and I'm guessing that a lot of people were writing to her that, come on out. And she wrote a long piece on her Facebook account saying that I can't. There are too many people who've died before me to do this, for me to back away now. So in a completely, again, people who have been at this for a long time know the risks and continue to do this, deserve all of our support and appreciation for what they do. And I think in the end, I agree with Andrei and defer to him as far as knowledge of kind of inside Kremlin intrigue and so forth. The competitions, I don't know that there's, I don't have a dog in this fight. There's the competitions inside don't mean that any of the parties are necessarily good or democratic. But the possibility that through their own internal contradictions and opening may emerge, I think is still there, and it's the hope. And again, to summon Andrei Piantkovsky, the hope is on one hand activists who are continuing to do this work, and on the other hand the possibility of internal fractures within the regime.
Some of you, before you leave, you may want to note that in the back of the room there's a picture of Elena Milashina, who came here in 2007 to receive the Democracy Award that we gave posthumously to Anna Politkovskaya, and we pray for her safety. Kyle?
I think that, looking forward, we should certainly prepare for instability in Russia. I don't take it for granted that Putin's going to be there for the next 10 years. I have no idea, but I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if a couple of years go by and something happens the way things are. It seems like the tensions in the system are so high at the moment. I think that, I'm encouraged from our own perspective that this perennial American desire to, whether you want to call it reset or détente or Reagan's second term or whatever, looking into Putin's eyes in Ljubljana, this desire to think that perhaps somehow in our charm and good looks is, we'll do it with the Russians or with the Kremlin elite. I think Clinton's going to win the presidency. She's been around the block with the Russians a lot. So, and has a lot of people on her team who have done so as well. So I hope we're not out there immediately looking for wins. I think we should approach this in a much humbler way on the fact that if we can simply keep the light on for our friends in Russia, if we can keep our mission open in Moscow, if we can simply do that, then a lot of the rest of it is really beyond our hands. If we can bolster the region, Ukraine and others, is sort of a, if you will, a geographical containment and not an ideological one, but, making sure that Putin stays within his internationally recognized borders, and he isn't right now, right? So, I think there's some reason for encouragement there, and just to the what we've said on the personal level, people like Boris Nemtsov, Anna Politkovskaya. This picture I brought over, just, I got it from a friend, Vladimir Karamurza, who many of you know, and who faced his own, mysterious poisoning in Moscow. And this was one of the postcards that, the placards that was carried actually in Moscow at sort of what was the funeral march for Boris. Tens of thousands of Moscovites out in the streets, and it says, a hero doesn't die. And I think that's really true. And, it's been for me the privilege of a career to have been able to just hear the stories of such people. And I mean, they really are bona fide heroes, and the message they have is universal. It's not just for the Russia street, right? Like there's a lot for